Clean, well-planned power is vital for a computer system. As far as the typical A-plus technician is concerned, power starts at your building's electrical panel and continues on through to the AC outlets, power protection equipment, and then the PC with the power supply, and then internally with the DC power connections inside that PC. Now, the A-plus exam is most concerned with the power supply and the internal power connections. Generally, a 500-watt power supply, like the one shown here, is enough for basic systems. But not if you're doing some powerful computing. Then you might need 600 watts or 750 watts or even 1,000 watts or even more. Underpowered systems can lead to all kinds of failures, intermittent failures or permanent failures. The power supply must meet the requirements of your computer and then some. A good engineer always overplans, at least a little bit, right? So power planning should be right up there with the choice of CPU, RAM, and motherboard. It's all intertwined. Most of the time, I will refer to the power supply unit as either power supply or PSU. And PSU stands for power supply unit. And CompTIA will sometimes use that acronym as well. Now, the power supply unit in a PC is in charge of converting alternating current, or AC, which is drawn from the wall outlets, into direct current to be used by the computer. And that direct current is going to come out of all these ports. The PSU, the power supply unit, then feeds the devices in the computer. For example, the 24-pin connection to the motherboard, a 6 or 8-pin PCI Express power connection to the GPU, SATA connections, 15-pin SATA power connections to the hard drives and optical drives. You've also got the CPU fan and other case fans, and also the 8 or 4-pin CPU connection for power as well. So the power supply unit feeds everything inside that system. Use a certified and reliable brand. Make sure that the power supply unit meets the standards that are set by organizations such as the IEC or the FCC or UL and so on. And also that it meets the RoHS directive, RoHS, for things like lead and mercury. So you want to remember to plan accordingly. You should know the type of power supply you need, for example, ATX most of the time, and the compatibility of that power supply with the rest of your system. You also want to know the wattage and capacity requirements, and you can use a power calculator for that, and I'll show that in another video. You also want to know the number and type of connectors that you'll be using. So remember, the power supply unit, or PSU, converts AC to DC, and it feeds that direct current to all the stuff inside the computer. Now let's look here on a typical power supply unit at the different parts here. Okay, here we have the back, and what we're looking at here, we have a port that is the C14 inlet for the IEC power cable, which is defined in the IEC 6320 spec, right? And so the cable itself connects to this with a C13 line socket, and on the other end, it goes out to the AC outlet with a 3-prong connector. Here we have a shutoff switch, also known as a kill switch. If you turn that off, then no power will come to this. It'll block this altogether. But it's still a good idea to unplug the computer before you do any types of work. And over here, we also have a voltage selector. And right now it's upside down, but this is set to 115, which also is the same as 120 volts AC. In other countries, you may have to select 230. So what this indicates to us is that this is a dual voltage power supply. Again, should be set in 115 volt in the United States and some other countries, but it has that 230 volt for other countries, and an additional adapter might be necessary for the different wall outlets that you might encounter. Never change the voltage selector switch while the computer is running or plugged in, and be sure to check this setting before you initially use the power supply. Now, back in the day, all of the cables came directly out of the power supply unit, and you had little control. More and more, though, today, power supplies are modular, meaning that you connect the power cables into the power supply, as well as into the other side with the motherboard, the CPU, and everything else. So on the left here, we have a fully modular power supply unit, and all these connections, the cables plug directly into that. On the right here, we have a partially modular connection. And so we have PCI Express ports here for our video cards. Then we have our Molex connectors, also known as peripheral, for our hard drives, SATA, and so on. And that's just on this end. On the other end, it'll look like an SATA connection if you have the right cables. But then you also have actual cables coming out of there. So you have multiple options with that one. That's a partially modular as opposed to this, which is fully modular. Okay, so know the difference between those. And let's go ahead and show an actual power supply now and its connections. Okay, let's talk about power connector types. Here we have a standard ATX power supply, and this is what we're going to install to our computer. And you can see we have some cables coming out and some ports here. Now, the main power connector that you'll use to supply power to the motherboard is this guy here, and this is a 24-pin connector. Back in the day, these used to be known as 20-pin connectors and known as the P1 connector, and it in fact still has the name P1 on there. But they added 4 pins after a while, and that's the standard now, 24-pin ATX connector. So that's going to connect directly to the motherboard, and this supplies positive 5, positive 12, positive 3.3, negative 5, and negative 12 voltages, plus you have the black ground wires. So this is your main power connector to the motherboard, and we'll connect that in one of the following sub-lessons. Another one of the connectors we see here, we have a couple. The first is the connectors for additional CPU power. These are each 4-pin connectors, and there's 2 of them. And so these are labeled as P3, and you can see that you got 2 4-pin connectors here. So those are going to connect to the motherboard as well for additional CPU power. And finally, we have another cable here, and this is for your PCI Express video cards. And it's a 6-pin connector, and then you have an additional 2 pins in case you have an 8-pin connector on the video card. And you can see here it says PCIe, PCI Express. So we're not actually going to use this on the video card that we have on the computer because it doesn't need any additional power. It gets power from the motherboard. But I most likely will upgrade and will need a 6-pin connector, possibly an 8-pin connector. Now, if we look here, we see we have additional ports. And this is where we connect our additional power connectors for things like secondary video cards. For example, here, you can see it says 12-volt PCI Express hard drives. You can connect a power connector to this for an additional PCI Express video card or for hard drives. And they give you an extra cable. And you can see this one has a red connector. And so that's actually just going to connect right to the power supply itself. And it snaps in with the little tab here that locks it in place. And then the other end, this would go to the PCI Express port on the video card. And then you have an additional 4 ports, and these are meant for hard drive only. And these also use the 6-pin power connector, and they give you a cable, actually 2 cables for this. And you can see this. This is the 6-pin power connector. That would just connect right to one of these. And again, with the tab facing down. So it snaps in place. But if you look further on this, you'll see there's 3 SATA power connectors. 1, 2, and 3. And that's your standard 15-pin SATA power. And so if you have 3 drives or less, the one cable is enough. But generally, they give you a second one. This way you can add more drives. Or if you want your drives to run on separate rails of power, you could have one connected to this cable and another one connected to the cable on here. And that's what's also good about the additional PCI Express power connector. You could have your main PCI Express, which comes from here, but then you could have a separate PCI Express power for a second video card coming from here, and it would run on separate rails, which is good. This way you don't overheat the system. And that's pretty much automatic. You don't have a choice about that, so that's a nice feature of this. Okay, let's look at the back ports here. There's just the one port, the C14 inlet, and that's going to be for your main power cable. Quite often we'll refer to this as an IEC power cable, and the power supply should come with a new IEC cable. Make sure you use the one that came with the power supply. And this is known as an auto-sensing power supply, which means that it will auto-sense what voltage you're connecting to. In the US, this will be your typical 120 volt outlet. In other countries, that'll be 240. And it might be labeled as 115, 230. It depends. It might not be labeled at all. But ones like this are auto-sensing. Older power supplies would have a little red switch, as shown in the picture here. And that allows you to select which voltage you want. In addition, you see a hard on-off switch. It's just a rocker switch, on, off. This allows you to kill the power. Sometimes it's referred to as a kill switch, but it allows you to kill the power without disconnecting the cable, which is a nice feature. And I always get that on my power supplies. If I'm ever doing any troubleshooting, I really don't feel like disconnecting the power itself. I just want to turn it off here. And when you're done, though, just make sure that you click it back on so that it does work. And we have a fan on the bottom. That's going to exhaust the hot air out of the case. And you want to make sure you have that vent on the bottom of the case. Sometimes those will have a filter as well. Our case has a filter, and you want to clean that out once in a while if you work in a dusty environment, really in any environment. And so there's your power connectors.